The greedy brothers destroyed everything and abandoned my dying father. I was left alone to start the farm from scratch. What a secret he revealed to me. You won't believe it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see the geography of our viewers. I always woke before the sun, not out of necessity, but because I couldn't sleep much anymore. The stillness of the early morning wrapped around the house like a cold shroud, and I found strange comfort in it. Before the world stirred, before the birds found their voice, I'd be out by the barn, boots half-laced, coat collar turned up against the wind, listening to the creak of hinges and the low rumble of a waking earth. It was quiet in a way that city people don't understand. Not silence, no. The kind of quiet that breathes, that watches. The barn door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, the cows shifted in their pens, snorting gently, their warm breath hanging in the air like ghosts. I moved among them with a practiced rhythm. Feed, water, clean, check hooves, patch the old fence where the wind had worked its fingers into the wood. My hands moved by memory. There was no need for thought anymore. Out here, time was measured in calluses and frost. The house stood behind me like a tired sentinel, its once sapral siding now sun-bleached and chipped. It looked too big now. With just the two of us, it felt like the rooms had grown wider, emptier, more hollow than they'd ever been. My father hadn't come downstairs in 6 months. He spent his days lying in the old room at the end of the hall, wrapped in silence and shadows. After the stroke, he spoke little, moved less. Sometimes I wondered if he even knew who I was. I brought him breakfast every day, eggs, toast, coffee, sometimes oatmeal if the weather seemed colder than usual. I'd place the tray on the side table and speak to him, tell him about the cows, the weather, what I'd fixed, what broke again. He never replied. His eyes followed me, but his mouth didn't move. At first, I hoped for a word. Then, I just wanted a blink. After a while, I stopped asking and started accepting. This wasn't the life I planned for myself. But plans don't matter much to land like this. It pulls you in, roots you, reshapes your dreams until they resemble something you can carry in your hands. I used to think I'd leave someday. Go west maybe, start something on my own. But life, it seems, had its own stubborn script. I still remembered the smell of fresh-cut hay in July, the way it clung to your skin and filled your lungs like a promise. I remembered sitting on my father's lap while he drove the old tractor through the south field, my fingers wrapped around the steering wheel just below his. He called it teaching the land, but really, it was the land teaching us. Every furrow, every patch of stubborn soil, every lost boot in the mud, it all carved something into us, something permanent. Back then, the three of us boys shared the upstairs bedroom. Mark always had his head in a manual tinkering with toy engines. Ellis read magazines about cities he'd never been to, always talking about big buildings and clean clothes. And me, I was usually on the porch, watching the cows, listening to the wind bend through the corn. I liked the smell of the earth after rain. They thought it was stupid. As we grew older, it became clear I wasn't like them. Mark went off to technical college. Ellis studied business and finance. They came back in suits and cologne, always acting like the dirt was contagious. Dad used to laugh it off. "They'll come around," he'd say. "The land has a way of calling you back." But it never did. Not for them. Then, last spring, he collapsed out by the fence line. I'd found him face down in the grass, his right arm curled under him like it had forgotten what to do. The ambulance took too long. They always did out here. At the hospital, the doctors used words like cerebral infarction and prolonged deficit. All I heard was, he won't be the same. I stayed with him those first 3 nights, sitting in the hard plastic chair beside his bed, watching the monitors beep and blink. Mark and Ellis flew in the next day. They wore expensive coats and brought takeout. They stayed at a hotel, said the house was too drafty. Their voices were full of sympathy, their eyes full of calculation. It wasn't long before the talk started. Mark wanted to streamline the assets. Ellis spoke of liquidating the excess. They brought in a lawyer, a smarmy little man with too many teeth and a contract already prepared. They needed Dad's signature to transfer some of the land. just to help with medical costs, they said. I argued, of course, loudly, but they had a way of talking that always made me sound like the irrational one, and Dad, barely conscious, nodded when they asked him. I think he thought they were helping. The papers were signed. 2 days later, they left with the deeds to the East Fields, the old harvester, and what cash was left in the house, safe. Ellis patted me on the back before leaving. You take care of him, Jack. It's what you're good at. I didn't answer. Couldn't. I just watched them drive away in their rented car, kicking up dust on the road that used to lead home. What they left behind was a shell of what had once been. Half the land, no equipment, and a broken man upstairs. I should have left then. Sold what was left, moved into town, found a job with heating and health insurance. But something in me said no. Not yet. Not like this. So I stayed. I repaired the fences with spare nails and bent boards. I plowed with an old Massey Ferguson that coughed like a dying mule. I sold the chickens for feed money and learned to stretch groceries farther than I thought possible. At night, I sat beside Dad's bed, reading aloud from the old almanac or just sitting in the silence, pretending it didn't feel like goodbye. The neighbors stopped by less and less. I couldn't blame them. It was hard to see something die in slow motion, harder still to watch someone cling to it. But something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe I just didn't know how to quit, or maybe I couldn't bear the thought of being like them, of walking away when things got hard. Each morning, I'd stand by the porch steps, look out over what remained of our land, and promise myself I'd make it one more day. Not for glory, not for inheritance, just because someone had to. I didn't know then that someone was watching. I didn't know how much he saw, and I sure as hell didn't know what he was hiding. But I would find out soon enough, and everything would change. Spring passed with a kind of quiet fury. The land, even stripped and tired, still tried to grow. Grass pushed through the cracks in the old pathways, and the trees blossomed as if unaware of the ruin that surrounded them. I worked from dawn until well after dark, patching fences, reworking the irrigation lines, and nursing the cows through a brutal season of wet chill and false starts. Every day blurred into the next, marked only by the arc of the sun and the rhythmic tasks that came with trying to breathe life into something half dead. The land fought me at every turn, but I refused to back down. Not yet. The generator quit one night during a rainstorm. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a flashlight and a can of beans when the lights flickered once and went out. I cursed, pulled on my boots, and trudged through the mud to the shed. The wind tore at my coat, and the rain soaked through in minutes. I spent 2 hours elbow deep in rust and oil, holding a wrench in one hand and a prayer in the other. When the thing finally sputtered back to life, it sounded like an animal in pain, but it held. I stood there for a moment, water streaming down my face, and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I had nothing left to cry. Inside, the house was colder than I remembered. I'd shut off most of the upstairs heat to save power, which meant my father's room was barely warmer than the night air. He hadn't stirred during the outage. He never did anymore. I stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, or pretend to. His chest rose and fell, slow and even, and for a moment I imagined he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the reach of broken machines and failing suns. The days crawled, the work grew harder, feed prices climbed, the fields yielded less than I'd hoped, and with half the equipment gone, every job took twice the time and 4 times the effort. My body ached constantly. My hands cracked and bled. I lost 12 pounds by the end of June and started talking to myself out loud, not in madness, but in desperate need to hear a voice in the stillness. No one called. No one wrote. Ellis sent one email in April asking if I needed help selling what remained of the land. I didn't respond. Mark left a voicemail in May, something about an investment opportunity in Nashville. I deleted it without listening to the end. The house, once filled with clatter and shouting and music from the old radio, became a place of silence. I moved my things into the downstairs parlor and closed off the upper floor entirely except for Dad's room. I cooked simple meals: grits, beans, rice, and ate them at the kitchen counter, staring at the faded wallpaper and trying not to remember how things used to be. I stopped using the television altogether. The antenna had rusted out anyway. I didn't want the noise. I kept bringing meals to Dad. I shaved him every third day, brushed his hair when it started to mat, changed his linens every week. He never thanked me, never spoke. Sometimes his eyes followed me as I worked around the room. Other times he stared at the ceiling as if it were a sky only he could see. I didn't ask for more. I just kept going. In the middle of a long, hot afternoon, I found myself staring at the east pasture, the one they'd taken. It looked overgrown and neglected, the grass too tall and the fences sagging. A strange, ugly feeling rose in my chest, bitter and sharp. They had taken what they thought was valuable. They'd left the mess. And yet, here I was, still cleaning. One night in early July, the fridge went out. I found myself on the floor at 2 a.m. surrounded by puddles of spoiled milk and melted ice, clutching a broken socket wrench in one hand and a bottle of warm beer in the other. I laughed again, the same hollow sound that had become my only release. Then I wept, not because of the fridge, but because I suddenly realized I hadn't heard my own name spoken aloud in months. Then came the letter. It arrived folded inside a yellowing envelope, no return address, the postmark too smudged to read. It was from my mother, dated 2 years before her death. I found it tucked inside an old ledger book when I was sorting through the hallway closet, trying to make room for extra blankets. The letter wasn't long, it wasn't poetic or dramatic, it was just her, in her neat, looping cursive, telling me that she had always known I would be the one to stay, that my father, despite all his silence and sternness, saw more in me than I understood. "He's an oak tree," she wrote, "tough bark, deep roots, but he leans toward the sun when you're around, Jack. You may not see it, but I do. One day, he'll show you." I sat there on the floor for hours after reading that. I couldn't bring myself to move. Her words hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. I'd thought she died not knowing how we'd all drifted apart, but she had known. She had watched it happen, and she had still believed in something. Someone. I folded the letter and kept it in my wallet. I carried it with me like armor. The first real change came one morning in mid-September. The air had turned crisp overnight, and the leaves on the elm by the porch were just beginning to brown at the edges. I was feeding the cattle when I heard a sound behind me, soft, dragging, like someone sliding their feet across the porch floor. I turned, and there he was, my father, standing. He was gripping the porch post with one hand, hunched slightly, his pajamas too loose on his thin frame, but he was standing. His eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months. He didn't speak right away, just stared at me like I was something unfamiliar and half forgotten. I ran to him, afraid he might fall, but he waved me off. "Did you fix the Massey?" he asked. His voice was rough, low like a rusty hinge, but the words were real, alive. I nodded, too stunned to answer properly. "Good," he said. Then he sat down on the top step and looked out at the fields. I didn't press him for more. I didn't dare. I sat beside him, silent, heart pounding. We watched the sky brighten together, 2 silhouettes in the morning mist. After that, things changed, slowly. He didn't return to full strength, not at once, but he began to move more. Small walks down the hallway. Sips of coffee taken from a real mug instead of a straw. He even shaved himself one day, though he nicked his chin badly and cursed the whole time. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, it was usually to ask questions about the farm. How were the south fences holding? Did the calves take to the new feed? Had I checked the well near the back orchard? I answered him, always, with the same honesty I'd given the land. No embellishments, no lies. And he listened. There was one evening, late in the season, when I found him standing by the back window, watching the sun set over the western ridge. The light caught his face just so, casting long shadows down his cheekbones. He looked older than I remembered, smaller, but not broken. "Why did you stay?" he asked suddenly, without turning. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say something meaningful. something that would make him understand. But all I could offer was the truth. Because I couldn't leave, he nodded once, slowly, and said no more. That was enough. From that point on, he joined me in the small things, watching the repairs, holding tools, sometimes even guiding my hands when a bolt was stubborn or a hinge refused to align. He wasn't the man he once was, but he was there. That counted for more than I knew. We didn't speak of the others. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the bitterness still raw. But there was a quiet understanding between us now, something forged in shared silence, in the grit of hard work and harder forgiveness. Autumn came quickly. The harvest was thin, but enough. I managed to sell just enough to break even, and for once, I didn't feel like I was drowning. We sat on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in old quilts, sipping weak coffee and watching the horizon darken into stars. He never thanked me, not with words. But one morning, as I passed him his breakfast tray, he reached out and gripped my wrist, just for a moment, just long enough for me to feel the strength still in his fingers. "You're a good man, Jack," he said. Then he looked away, as if ashamed of the admission. But I heard it. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, we weren't finished. Not him, not me, not this place. The land had been quiet for a long time, but I could feel it breathing again. And so could he. The days grew shorter, the wind colder. Leaves turned and fell, curling like brittle hands across the dirt paths I walked each morning. But inside the house, something had shifted. The silence wasn't so heavy anymore. There were sounds now. Footsteps on the stairs, the scrape of a chair being pulled back from the table, the steady thrum of a man who had decided not to die after all. My father began speaking more. Not long sentences or stories, not yet, but questions, small directives, a grunt here and there that sounded more like himself than he had in nearly a year. He'd sit at the table wrapped in a flannel robe, staring at the window like he was reading some message only he could decipher in the line of the horizon. I caught him scribbling notes in the margins of an old ledger once, muttering about crop rotations and soil acidity. It was the first time in a long while I saw something alive behind his eyes. We worked in tandem, in our own lopsided way. He couldn't do much with his body, but he directed, guided, reminded. I'd lift and repair and dig while he'd sit nearby, correcting my grip or pointing at a bolt I missed. Some days I felt like a child again, chasing after the approval of the man who taught me how to drive a tractor and check the sky for rain. Other days, I simply felt grateful that he was here at all. He rarely mentioned Mark or Ellis. I could see the thoughts moving behind his eyes whenever their names brushed the edge of a conversation, but he never followed through. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was still sorting through the wreckage they'd left behind. Maybe it was something else entirely. I didn't press him. I had my own bitterness, and I was doing my best to bury it deep enough not to taste it every time I opened my mouth. It was mid-October when he asked me to take him to the attic. I remember the moment vividly. The morning sun had just begun to warm the frost from the porch railings. We were sitting in the kitchen, finishing breakfast. Scrambled eggs, dry toast, and coffee that tasted more like memory than flavor. "Jack," he said, his voice low but clear, "I need you to help me upstairs." I looked up from my plate. "You mean to your room?" "No," he said, shaking his head slowly, "to the attic." The attic hadn't been opened in years, not since before Mom died. It was the sort of place you forgot existed until you heard something scurry above your ceiling tiles. Dust, boxes, old furniture. Nothing more than a storage crypt for things no one needed anymore. "You sure you're up for that?" I asked. "Those stairs aren't exactly friendly." He gave me a look. One of those old stares I remembered from when I was 16 and thought I knew better than him. "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't sure," he said. So we did it. It took nearly 20 minutes. I went ahead, pulled the string to lower the steps, then braced the ladder with one hand while he climbed slowly, shakily, step by step. I hovered behind him like a nervous mother, ready to catch him if he stumbled. But he didn't. When we reached the top, the attic felt like stepping into the past. Dust motes danced in the light streaming through the single, dirty window. Boxes lined the far walls, labeled in my mother's handwriting. A rocking chair stood in the corner, the cushion faded and threadbare. I could smell cedar and old paper. "Over there," he said, pointing toward a stack of trunks near the back. We made our way over. He knelt slowly, too slowly, and I moved to help, but he waved me off. With a grunt, he pulled aside an old quilt and began feeling along the wall behind the trunks. After a moment, he stopped, his fingers resting on a small wooden panel I had never noticed. He pressed it once, twice, then pulled. The panel popped free, revealing a narrow space in the wall. Inside was a steel box the size of a briefcase. He handed it to me. "Go ahead," he said. I sat down on the floor, set the box on my lap, and opened the latch. Inside were papers, dozens of them, deeds, titles, financial statements, legal contracts with names I didn't recognize, bank records dating back 10 years. I leafed through them slowly, confusion giving way to something like disbelief. "These are all ours?" I asked. He nodded. "I thought they took everything." "They took what I let them take," he said. "The rest I protected." I looked at him, stunned. "You knew?" He didn't answer right away. He turned to the window, stared out into the golden haze of autumn light. "I suspected," he said finally. "Your brothers, my sons, are clever. But they're not patient. They never respected the land, never understood what it meant. They thought this place was a burden, and they thought I was a fool." He shifted his gaze to me, his eyes harder than I'd seen them in years. "I played the fool long enough to see who would stay." A silence stretched between us. I didn't know what to say. My chest felt tight, my thoughts tangled. Part of me was furious. He'd let me suffer, work myself to the bone, nearly lose the whole damn place, and for what? A test? But beneath that anger was something else, something deeper, a kind of raw, unfiltered awe. "You could have told me," I said, not as an accusation, but as a question. "I could have," he admitted, "but you needed to choose, not because of money, not because of inheritance, because of who you are." He leaned back against a beam and closed his eyes. "I knew you had it in you," he said softly. "I just needed to see if you knew it too." We sat there for a long while. I read through the rest of the documents. He explained some of them. How he'd moved certain assets into a trust before his stroke. How he'd bought back parcels of land through third parties. How he'd secured water rights to the neighboring properties that no one else had bothered with. He'd built a safety net, piece by piece, quietly and methodically, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. "And the others?" I asked. "Do they know?" He shook his head. "They think they won. Let them. They got their slice of meat, but they missed the marrow." That night, after I helped him back down the stairs and into bed, I stayed up reading through every line of every paper. My hands trembled as I held those keys to a future I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just about land. It was about possibility, opportunity. He hadn't just preserved the farm. He'd positioned it for something greater. Processing, production, expansion. The infrastructure was within reach, hidden in these papers and quiet partnerships and pending deals I could now take the reins of. The next morning, we drafted a plan. He laid it out like an old general mapping his battlefield. There was a local grant for sustainable energy we could tap into. The west field could be converted into a sorghum plot for bioethanol. The old storage barn could be gutted and repurposed into a small-scale processing unit. He even had to contact some retired engineer from Louisiana who specialized in agricultural automation who owed him a favor. I listened, I took notes, I asked questions, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was building something again, not just patching holes in a sinking ship. We worked every day after that. I did the lifting, the hauling, the sweating. He made the calls, handled the paperwork, kept the books. He was sharp, sharper than I remembered, and beneath that sharpness, I saw something that looked almost like pride. When I walked into town to speak with the zoning board about construction permits, I carried myself differently. I wasn't just the farmer scraping by anymore. I was a man with a vision, and a damn good reason to believe in it. We kept it quiet, of course. No announcements, no fanfare, just motion. Quiet, deliberate motion. One afternoon, as we stood beside the old tractor and talked about soil amendments, he looked at me and said, "I was wrong about a lot of things, Jack, but not you." I didn't respond. I just nodded, afraid that if I opened my mouth, all the years of silence and hurt and stubborn loyalty would come spilling out in a flood I couldn't stop. Instead, I went back to work, because that's what we did. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just following in his footsteps. I was walking beside him. The first snow came early that year. It dusted the fields in silence, layering over fence posts and tractor ruts like someone trying to cover the bruises of a hard season. I watched it fall from the kitchen window while my father sat beside me, thumbing through his worn notebook, a pencil resting behind his ear like it had always belonged there. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both felt it, the rhythm returning, slow but steady, like the land itself was waking up again. The weeks that followed moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. Orders were placed, deliveries arrived, permits were signed and posted on the old barn door like declarations of intent. I turned the west pasture, laid out a foundation, and built the frame for what would become our processing shed. A neighbor down the road, a welder named Rick, came by one afternoon, offering his hands for free, said he heard we were finally doing something smart with the place. I didn't ask what he meant. I just gave him gloves and a hammer and told him where to start. By the end of November, we had a crew. Nothing official, just folks who remembered what this land used to be and weren't too proud to help it become something more. My father, though still frail, kept his chair near the construction, wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, barking suggestions and occasionally catching a mistake before it turned into a disaster. He might not have had his old strength, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. There was something healing in it all, in the noise of hammers, in the smell of sawdust and diesel, in the laughter that came when someone dropped a board on their own foot. I hadn't heard real laughter on this property in so long, I'd almost forgotten how much it mattered. I'd sometimes pause at the edge of the field, watching it all unfold, and feel something inside me loosen. Not pride, not exactly, not relief either, more like a quiet recognition of purpose, of continuity, of belonging. The land was giving back, not in the way I expected, and not as quickly as I wanted, but in its own way, at its own pace. Then, just as things were finally starting to steady, they came back. I was in the barn repairing the hayloft pulley system when I heard the car. Too clean an engine for any of our vehicles. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans, and saw it. A black SUV, shiny and new, crunching over the gravel like it didn't belong there. The door opened and out stepped Ellis. Behind him, Mark, both in coats that cost more than everything in my house combined. They looked around like tourists, like this place was some kind of museum exhibit. "Jack," Ellis called, flashing that politician's smile of his, "you've really been busy." Mark didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He glanced toward the half-built processing shed, the new fencing along the south edge, the trucks parked in a neat row near the old silo. "What do you want?" I asked, not moving. "Can't we just visit our brother?" Ellis said. "It's been months." "Try almost a year." "Well, time flies." My father must have heard them. A moment later, I saw him appear on the porch, slow but steady, his cane tapping against the wooden steps. He stood there, arms crossed, watching. "We heard about the expansion," Mark finally said. "Someone in town mentioned bioethanol, said Carter Farm's going green. We also heard about the grant," Ellis added. "Impressive work, really. And we thought, well, maybe we got off on the wrong foot last year. Maybe we acted hastily." "Hastily," I repeated, the word like ash in my mouth. They looked around again, trying to hide the hunger in their eyes. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, when they were younger, fighting over who got the bigger piece of pie at dinner. It hadn't changed, only now the pie was my home, my labor, my life. We were thinking, Ellis said, stepping forward, that it might be time to bring the family back together. Join forces. You've done incredible work here, Jack, and we want to help. Invest, share resources. We could scale this, maybe even go national. I laughed, quietly at first, then louder. Mark flinched. You want in now? I said. Now that it looks valuable? Now that someone else did the work? We're your brothers, Mark snapped. You really want to keep us out of the family's legacy? I walked toward them, slow and deliberate, until I stood just a few feet away. You already had your share, I said. You took it and ran. You sold off pieces of our family for a quick payout and disappeared. Ellis raised his hands, palms open. It was complicated, Jack. You know that. No, I said. It was simple. You saw a broken man and a failing farm and you took what you could. You didn't think it would survive. You didn't think I would. I pulled the folder from my coat. My father's legal documents, the trust agreements, the final will and testament. I'd kept them close, waiting for this moment. I handed them the top page. Ellis read it. His face went pale. The land, the assets, the business, it's all mine, I said. Signed, sealed, and witnessed. You got what you asked for. I got what I earned. They stared at me like they didn't understand the language I was speaking. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they never would. You're making a mistake, Mark muttered. Family should stick together. Family should act like family, I replied. I turned and walked away. I didn't need to see them leave to know they would. The crunch of tires over gravel told me enough. I didn't watch the road. I didn't watch the horizon. I looked up. At the sky. At the clouds rolling slow and soft like the breath of the land itself. That night, I sat on the porch with my father. The stars were sharp above us, and the wind carried the smell of the first frost. He sipped his coffee. I sipped mine. Though my came, I said. I figured they might be my wanted in. And you told them? Yeah. He nodded. Did right. I looked at him then, at the lines in his face, the way his hands rested calmly on the arms of the old chair. There was no tension in him, no fear, just peace. I think Mom would have liked what we've done, I said. She would have, he agreed. She'd be proud of you. The words sat heavy between us, not like a burden, but like a stone you could build on. We didn't speak much after that, just sat there, two men at the edge of something they never thought they'd see again, a future. The next morning, I rose before dawn. The earth was still hard with cold, but the sky promised warmth later. I walked the property slowly, my boots cracking frost beneath them. I stopped by the new shed, touched the frame with my hand, and smiled. The land had remembered me. After everything, after the loss, the silence, the betrayal, it had remembered. And in its own time, in its own way, it had given back. Not out of kindness, but out of respect. Because I stayed, because I worked, because I believed. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, that's everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video right here and feel free to share this one with someone who loves a good story.